physicians say, oh, 130 over 70, that's not too bad.
Right.
But then you look at that and the pulse pressure is way too high. So really pay attention to the pulse pressure.
And then what does that result in, right? Like for your when it's high like that, you say that that's when your arteries stiffen. What exactly can that cause?
So when your arteries stiff, they stiffen often as you get older, and that makes it very hard for the blood to get into. Well, first of all, you need really good elasticity for blood to go in and out of your arteries. Now, when they get stiff, they're not going to be able to get as much blood through those arteries. Your heart really has to pump hard to get enough blood through them. So increased blood pressure, the possibility of rupturing that artery because of the pressure is so high. So that's why when you look at blood pressure, pulse pressure, there is a higher incidence of cardiovascular events, mortality, valve disease.
Do you have any tips on taking your blood pressure at home? Because that's one of your lifestyle changes is to monitor your blood pressure. That's something you can get a blood pressure cuff from the Walgreens or CVS, something like that, really quickly. But I've found it difficult for myself to do it at home. Any tips on how to make it a little easier or know that you're actually doing it correctly?
Yes, and a lot of people actually don't do it correctly. You want to make sure first when you take your blood pressure, you're very relaxed. You're sitting down, your feet are flat on the floor, your body is supported, and your arm before you take your blood pressure, or else it'll be elevate.
Today's video is on the subject of pulse pressure. This is an interesting parameter that can give us very helpful information about the overall state of our cardiovascular health. Now, blood pressure is usually expressed in two sets of values. For example, if you have a blood pressure reading, it will usually say something like 120 over 80. The 120 refers to the systolic blood pressure. This is the pressure. Now, if you subtract the diastolic number from the systolic number, you get a third value, and this is called the pulse pressure. And this is a reading that can provide even more information about the overall health of our cardiovascular system. So if your systolic blood pressure is 120 and your diastolic is 80, then your pulse pressure is 120 minus 80 equals 40. In general, if the pulse pressure is less than 25% of the higher reading, the systolic pressure, then it is considered to be low. And if the pulse considered to be low. And
so in this case, you are the
then it is considered to be high. So in our example, then it is considered to be low. And if the pulse pressure is more than 100 millimeters of mercury, then it is considered
100.
which is less than 25% of the systolic reading, and then it will be considered low. On the other hand, if the blood pressure was 120/15, then the pulse pressure would be considered excessively large or wide because it is above 100. Different conditions may cause the pulse pressure to be too low or too high. But to understand how these conditions affect the pulse pressure, we have to first understand the systolic and diastolic pressures, because calculation of the pulse pressure is dependent on the systolic and the diastolic pressures. I'll go into this in more detail, but in essence, any condition that increases systolic pressure without concomitantly increasing diastolic pressure, or any condition that reduces diastolic pressure without reducing the systolic pressure, will lead to an increased pulse pressure, and vice versa. Let's see what factors govern systolic pressure first. Now, I love this analogy, and the analogy is of inflating a balloon. Think of inflating a balloon. So you've got the balloon and you blow in it. Now, during systole, the heart is ejecting blood into our blood vessels. So it's a little bit like us blowing into this balloon. So the pressure in the balloon and the pressure in our blood vessels during systole, when we're actually pushing blood in, is governed by the heart rate. How much blood is pumped out with each heartbeat. This is also called the stroke volume. The viscosity of the blood, and also the elasticity of the blood vessels. So if we think of inflating the balloon, the pressure in that balloon will be dependent on how fast we're blowing in, how much we're blowing in with each breath, what we're blowing in, viscosity of what we're blowing in, and the stretchability of the balloon. If we blow with more speed and vigor, the pressure goes up much higher. If the balloon itself is not very stretchable, then the pressure will be much higher within the balloon, right? So if the balloon isn't very stretchable, whatever you're doing will cause a much higher pressure within the balloon, because the balloon is not stretching to accommodate that extra effort. Exactly the same applies to our vascular system. If we have nice stretchy blood vessels, then the systolic pressure will not be as high as it would be if we had stiff blood vessels. So a rise in heart rate during exercise or stress, aging of our blood vessels due to, which causes increased stiffness, increased viscosity of blood, or simply having too much blood, such as when we're taking a high salt diet, will increase the systolic pressure. Now let's think of diastolic pressure. Now during diastole, the heart is relaxing, and the aortic valve, which is the valve which opens to allow the blood to pump blood out into these blood vessels, is actually closed. So the pressure in diastole is not governed by the heart anymore. It's not dependent on what's going on in the heart, because the heart is actually, the valve is closed. So when we are looking at diastolic pressure, the diastolic pressure is not really controlled by the heart rate or the stroke volume, because that's not what's happening in diastole. In diastole, the pressure is largely governed by the elastic recoil of the blood vessels themselves. Now imagine that balloon again. Okay, let's assume you've finished blowing into it and have now tied it up. The pressure in that balloon, when it is tied up like that, the pressure within it is determined by the elasticity of the walls of the balloon. So if they are recoiling, then the pressure would be high. If the balloon walls have good elasticity, they will exert a greater pressure. If the walls are stiff, then they exert less pressure. You can easily demonstrate this. Let go of the balloon and see how it flies off. It's flying off because of this recoil of the balloon walls pushing the air out. A stretchy balloon will fly off and go much further compared to a stiffer balloon, because the elastic recoil is greater, and therefore there is a higher diastolic pressure. So that's how we understand diastolic pressure. So what do the systolic and diastolic pressures tell us? Well, the systolic pressure is the highest pressure that our blood vessels are going to be exposed to, and therefore this is the number which, if excessively high, is most likely to do us damage. Out of the systolic and the diastolic, the systolic is more important, and that is what doctors try to manipulate favorably to reduce the deleterious impact of blood pressure in our bodies. The diastolic pressure is also important, but less important than the systolic pressure. The diastolic pressure tells us about the stretchability of our blood vessels. and therefore the health of our blood vessels. It is important that the diastolic pressure does not fall too